Okay. Welcome everyone to the Spatial Analytics Data Seminar Series, otherwise known as the SAD Seminars, which I did not entirely know what I was getting into when Rachel mentioned this, but have been pleasantly surprised. But my name is Megan Kelly, and I'm an assistant professor at Durham University. I'm thrilled to serve as your MC, your moderator, as someone just who gets to hang out with fun people for today's seminar. And so this is a very exciting Zoom room to be a part of. People I've met, people I've encountered, people I haven't met quite yet. And so we're all very happy for folks to be joining us today. I want to especially thank the seminar organizers for their invitation, as well as the organization of this event. There's a whole YouTube channel if you're interested and want to kind of go back in time, that I spent the better part of last night going through the archives, and so it's definitely worth folks' while. But today I just want to introduce the series, Dr. Sarah Elwood, as well as the logistics for the event. I am brand new to this series, and I think my main takeaway is that this series is just about getting folks together, whether that is across universities, across institutions, across continents, people that are in similar circles, people that are outside of different circles. I really see it as a place to bring conversation together and to think about spatial analytics and data as they play out in research, but also our everyday lives. The SAD interviews are an incredible subset of this larger project, or larger series. And the interviews are about making space for informal conversations with influencers of our generation within spatial analytics and data. And today we'll explore the trajectories of our interviewee, as well as the evolution, as well as the possibilities of this field more broadly. The interviews are brought to you by Newcastle University, Bristol University, and the Alan Turing Institute, and is co-sponsored by the Royal Geographical Society. So many thanks to all of them. And today we are incredibly lucky to have Dr. Sarah Elwood with us today. Dr. Elwood is a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Washington. Dr. Elwood's work contributes to a range of arenas, including relational poverty studies, critical GIScience and digital geographies, visual politics and mixed media and urban geographies. I myself am particularly inspired by Dr. Elwood's work on feminist digital geographies that engages with new horizons in the field that include queer and critical race theory, post-colonial feminism, and Black and queer code studies. This has truly been informative in my work, and it's just important work all around. After I wrap up here, I'll add links to Dr. Elwood's website, where you can learn more about her academic and public-facing work. So with that, I want to thank Dr. Elwood for being with us today. And moving more towards logistics, the interview will have 3 parts, and each part will be led by one of the SAD interview co-hosts. And our interview co-hosts include Dr. Daniel Arribas-Bel of the Alan Turing Institute and University of Liverpool, Dr. Levi Wolf of the University of Bristol, and Dr. Rachel Franklin of Newcastle University. From my understanding, each co-host will have about 15 minutes to chat, and that'll leave us hopefully some time for some questions at the end. And so feel free to use the Q&A function as part of the interface to add those in. I will also copy and paste the event's code of conduct in the chat for folks to review, and also subtitles are available, should be available at the bottom of your screen under live transcript if you find this supportive. I think I've covered the bases. And so my hard part is done, and I will hand it over to the rest of you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you, Sarah, for joining us today. So in my part of the interview, I usually like to talk a little bit about kind of people's backgrounds, where they grew up, how they got interested in what they do right now. And so I guess I'm wondering, looking at your career trajectory, what you do currently at Washington, one thing that's really notable to me is that you started off in geography. Can you walk me through a little bit how that happened? Why did you want to study it at the undergraduate level?
I always say in US geography, I'm one of those rare characters that has 3 degrees in geography, because coming out of a particular generation of American secondary education where geography is not taught as geography, so many of us discover it along the way. And so I didn't go to college intending to be a geography major, was taking a whole eclectic bunch of different kinds of courses at Macalester College in the early 90s, and took a world regional geography class of all things my first year, and just had that epiphany that so many people have about geography as a way of making sense of the world, where all of a sudden you have this sort of embodied sense of, oh, this makes sense.
Sure.
And, and I didn't have, so yeah, I think by the start of the second year, I was a geography major, and then had picked up some employment in the department, first as just an office assistant, and then as an undergrad TA and sort of lab, cartography lab support.
Gotcha.
And so that kind of amplified the engagement.
I see. And so it felt like kind of a social, but also an intellectual home for you from the start in that way, yeah?
Very much so. And in ways that I can't really make sense, because, as I think about sort of the histories of our field, the over many generations, the peopling of our field, so it shouldn't have felt at home.
Sure.
And yet it did. I think some of that was about being on a campus that had plenty of space to be in one kind of major, but then also be a real sort of intellectual and political omnivore, kind of taking in all kinds of things to sort of build that out.
Sure. And so you had this really wonderful experience in your undergrad studying geography, felt this kind of sense of intellectual community. Why do graduate school? Was there anything else on your mind at the time? Can you walk me through that?
Yeah. So it's the early 90s. I am studying geography, sort of doing a mix of urban geography and what was then sort of automated computerized cartography, sort of really early GIS, but also, training in manual cartography traditions. And then the rest of my coursework was sort of everything from computer science, environmental econ, to sort of Macalister's first gay and lesbian studies course, sort of course taught by the chaplain out of the religious studies department, titled The Literature of Hope.
Wow.
And so toward the end of my undergraduate studies, I sort of came to this T-junction of, am I sort of going to go to grad school in geography, or am I going to go to seminary and see about going down the path of ordained ministry? And at the time, the United Methodist Church, which is sort of the historical kind of family tradition that I come from, was really in its first of many waves of struggle over the ordination of queer people. And I was far enough out of the closet that it was clear going in. Back in was not an option.
Sure.
And, some really smart, beloved family friends, sort of my extra moms growing up, said, who were knee deep in this struggle, said, it's worth spending some time thinking about how much of your career you want to spend fighting to secure yourself versus what you can do if you're in a secure space. And the other one said, there's many ways to be in ministry and very few of them involve ordination, and a lot of them happen in secular worlds. And so, I took a load of that, but also my own fears about what that other path was going to be like, and got some offers to go to grad school and thought, I love this stuff too. Let's do it and see where
go
it
for
goes.
it. Yeah.
I didn't have an intent to be an academic. It was just, this is the next thing that is really interesting, rewarding, will pay the bills.
Right.
I almost walked away many times because the idea of having to leave the city where my partner and I both came out, where we met, we had such a sort of chosen community there. The idea of having to leave was unbearable. And I am daily glad we found the courage to do that.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting component, right? That you did your undergraduate at Macalester, and then you went down the road to Minnesota. But I noticed you said offers. How did you kind of decide on Minnesota, and what kind of made its intellectual environment stimulating to you at the time?
Some of the decision was very pragmatic through an accident of misunderstanding. I had applied at Syracuse, University of Oregon, Washington, and Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember hearing back from Syracuse. Maybe I did, but it didn't go anywhere.
Sure.
Oregon, the person I was going to work with was a dean, and that I just thought, like, how does that even work as an advisor? So I'm looking at the offer from Minnesota, the offer from Washington. I misunderstood the offer from Washington, and I thought, oh, they've offered me less support. They must not think that I'm PhD material. And it never occurred to me to ask for clarification. It was just like, oh, Minnesota must think that I can get a PhD, so I should go there. Mm-hmm. And it was this amazing moment of sort of early in what became, it was the ground floor of what became the GIS and society conversation that became critical GIS, that sort of has morphed to other things today. And so people across lines of thought in our field who hadn't typically had a lot to talk about were talking. And so there's a reading group there at the time. There was a faculty and grad student reading group at Minnesota that picked a book each quarter, read it, and discussed it, at faculty houses in the evening. I think we read, and it read eclectic. I want to say we read Gay New York, one of the first quarters, and we all wrote a review in the first issue of Gender, Place, and Culture. And then we read John Pickles' Ground Truth. And so for somebody with my I had a master's paper that was in sort of the early sexuality and space literature. I was also reading Pickles, like that sort of possibility at Minnesota of sort of intellectual collisions and multiplicities that in other places would have been seen as impossible.
Sure.
And I have to shout out to Helga Leitner and Eric Shepard, who, as graduate mentors throughout their career, had this just unwavering willingness to go with their graduate students on these journeys. Okay, we are in it to grow too. We can't quite get our head around where it is that you want to go in this project, but we're on board. Like, what a career-making gift to your students.
Yeah, for sure. It sounds very supportive and like a wonderful environment to be in. Now, if I may, you've kind of got a period of time where you're at DePaul, you went to Arizona, and then quite a bit of time spent at Washington. I'd like to ask a question about each of those parts in the time that we have remaining. So I'm just curious, kind of what drove your decision to go to DePaul after graduate school, and then maybe the transition to Arizona? What were you looking for, and what excited you about those places?
So when I went on the job market in fall of '99, and then into the winter of 2000, it was a really sort of odd moment, kind of the early maturity of critical GIS. GIScience as a field had at the time figured out it was sort of focused on the underrepresentation of women. And there was this kind of opening in sort of the intellectual imaginary of what a GIScience research agenda could include. But the reality hiring is oftentimes a deeply conservative moment in academia. And so I did more interviews than you can shake a stick at. And I would venture to guess that I had the proverbial snowball's chance of getting any of them. I was almost always in those years. There were some places that I think were very serious. There were allies who wanted to go there. But on a lot of the interviews, I was the gender and epistemological diversity. And so a project, the work that I was doing then was for critical theory human geographers. Because it was about GIS, there was a lot of anxieties about whether or not I was going to have any intellectual openness to the critiques that were being made.
Sure.
But on the sort of people who were more deeply vested in quantitative approaches and GIScience, because it was a critical agenda. And, in retrospect, I would say, because I was a very young female candidate, there were a lot of challenges about and critiques about, could I actually find my way around the technology? So I did a bunch of interviews. Why DePaul? They offered me a job.
Sure.
There were, you learn what went down in the searches that you were a part of. In the decade after you do those interviews, you learn what went down. I mean, it's worth saying on video that there was at least one of those where I learned later that explicit homophobia from academic leadership was in the room. Didn't get that job.
Yeah.
Probably,
Wow.
if that was the reason, didn't want that job. So DePaul offered me a job. And what so much of who I try to be as a chair borrows on Alex Papadopoulos, who was the chair then, and who was incredibly supportive of a very junior faculty, and offered us so much space. DePaul is a private faculty do research, but it is a more teaching intensive place. And it was a simultaneous, I was teaching urban and GIS. On the research side, they didn't care what I did. It was just go do something, be great.
Nice.
And that sort of, at a research one, a lot of times we get sort of super hands-on and micromanaging and anxious about junior faculty research agendas. There it was wide open. So I applied for an NSF career grant, which is something that forges a 5-year sort of research and teaching. It's a big sort of a commitment. And lightning struck and I got it. And I remember riding my bike home that January day when I learned that I got it and thinking as I rode home, holy schmoly, everything is different now. I don't know how, but I have this gut feeling that this changes the terms of everything that I'm going to do. And it did. And so that fall, the invitations to apply for jobs started coming. And at the time, I went to DePaul with no intention to leave. I loved, it's a student body that I love. At the time, the way that DePaul wore its sort of social justice Catholic identity gave me so much space to sort of teach and be in community in the ways that I felt were important. But yet I also wanted to have a sort of robust research life that I could see that Arizona as an infrastructure could offer. That was a hard departure. Departures are always hard for everybody. We went to Arizona. My partner does direct service mental health care. We went to Arizona not really fully understanding that in Tucson at the time, that was not a protected job. And this was the bad old days of gay and lesbian family law in the US. I could not provide her with health insurance. We didn't really understand. It was sort of poorly available in the jobs that she was eventually able to get. We were so lucky that nothing bad happened. I mean, bad things happened, but nothing sort of catastrophically, life-changingly bad happened. Because we were economically and healthcare wise so vulnerable. My colleagues at Arizona came to understand the huge gaps in the safety net for so many people, not just our community. through that experience, they fought hard to try to change it. But like the spring that I signed the offer at Washington, the Arizona state legislature passed a constitutional amendment to make the provision of domestic partner benefits unconstitutional.
Yeah.
And the Diocese of Arizona, the Catholic Diocese of Southern Arizona, endorsed it. We had to leave.
Yeah.
It was the only thing. And so like Washington, they were hiring to improve, to hopefully, bring somebody who was going to grow into what we do here.
Mm-hmm.
It was a move that saved us.
Sure. Sure. No, that makes sense. And then I guess we have a little bit more time just for a last question. You've now been at Washington for quite a while. Interestingly, during that time, you've gone straight from the start up to now being chair. How has your experience of Washington kind of changed over those years? And I guess, how have you changed with it?
Oh, that is such a big question. The idea that across different epistemological traditions, different methodological practices, different empirical interests, the thread that weaves this faculty together across its whole history is a commitment to the idea that social, economic, racial justice are at the heart of why we do what we do. Like
Sure.
that has been talked about in very different terms over the history of our department, and is today talked about in different terms by different of us, but we are connected through those commitments. But it's also true that this is a place that has gone through a whole lot of different kinds of identities.
Mm-hmm.
I am now, I think many academic faculties, every sort of 20, 25 years, you go through kind of a massive generational change where you have a bunch of retirements and a bunch of new hiring.
Sure.
And so when I joined this department, the senior faculty to me were, many of them, the community that was built in our last generational transition under Vicki Lawson's leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And so fast forward, we have been going through exactly another one of those in the last few years. And it is such an extraordinary time in geography to be doing a bunch of hiring. And but hiring is the hardest thing that academic departments do. And you throw in a pandemic on top. So I feel this enormous sense of hope and possibility and exhaustion and sort of heavy responsibility. It's happening.
Yeah.
And then intellectually in that time, I've kind of navigated through like the critical GIS chapter of my career, the sort of qualitative GIS, then to sort of how do we think these things in the context of other than GIS kinds of digitalities, to then 10 years of collaboration with Vicki around the Relational Poverty Network, and sort of to the kind of our newest thinking with a bunch of colleagues that really kind of disidentifies with sort of the notion that a relational theorization of impoverishment is sufficient or even the right way to go, to now, as Vicki is sort of moving to her next chapter as an emeritus faculty member, thinking about how do I bring the insights of the decade of our work back to sort of the part of my identity that's digital geographies. Where does that take me? I don't have a good answer to that, but I know that, in these kind of decadal resets that we do as with our sort of research and intellectual identity, like I'm at the bottom of the next mountain.
I see. The cyclical nature of self-identity. That's great. I'll let you talk a little bit more about that intellectual story with Danny now, but thank you so much for giving me your time.
Great, thanks very much, Levi, and super good segue into this second part. You said in the conversation, the chat with Levi, you said something about, I think it was McAllister being a great place for an intellectual omnivore. And I love that term of intellectual omnivore. I'm going to pick a little bit on that. For someone who didn't know you, it only takes a quick skim of your CV to realize that you are the embodiment of this idea of the intellectual omnivore, someone who spent anywhere from started doing GIScience when the field was starting, then as you were saying, qualitative GIScience, critical GIScience, and then at the same time a career on poverty studies, urban geography, so on the more applied aspect. And maybe I ask him for a friend. Whenever I see someone like this, I always wonder, how did that happen? How did you come about at stitching a career that was like that? Was that something intentional, that you always knew that you had all these interests, or is something that, something really interesting came up, you jumped on, and then something also really interesting on the next 10-year mountain that you were talking about came up, and you decided to try to bring all of these together? Was that something that you knew, say in 1991, you wanted to have this career, or is something that has been coming along as it went?
I always describe myself as so not traditionally or intentionally ambitious. Like, I'm not a kind of master planner or career sort of, human. And so like, I never really have an intent to say, oh, here's how all the pieces are going to fit together. It's much more the second thing you describe of what is the next interesting thing. And I think we arrive to those next interesting things so often in relation. And so the sort of people and communities in the academy and outside who are formative to ourselves, to our intellectual interests, our politics, I think kind of guide that work. And so I guess I have come to, even though I'm not sort of intentionally a sort of career ambition planner, I've come to trust my process in a way that if I focus on the things that seem urgent and interesting in the sort of spaces and relations that I'm in a given moment, and sort of really commit to that, knowing that it's one chapter among many, it doesn't have to define who I am for the rest of my career, that good things are going to happen. We just don't know what they are yet. And so
that's really powerful.
In geography, we have our stuff, don't get me wrong, a lot of it. We do a lot of intellectual gatekeeping, but we do, when we're at our best, make space for massive sort of changes of intellectual identity and focus over the course of a career. And so like the example of people like Eric Shepard, a Vicki Lawson, a Helga Leitner, whose fingerprints are all over my career and life. Like watching what it's been possible for them to do, I think has always given me a sort of deep trust that there will be space for those kinds of transitions for me. I also think that there's a piece of this, I've come to believe that there's a piece of this that is fundamentally identity stuff for me, in that queer life teaches us to hold complexity and to sort of live on the generative edge of the multiple things that sort of make you go, I wouldn't have thought that all that goes together. And we don't oftentimes think about like, where do our epistemological reflexes come from? And I've come to think that for me, queer life teaches me a particular sort of holding complexity that I have come to believe really inflects multiple aspects of my life, but especially kind of this academic journey.
And how do we teach the new generations more about being like these, more about trusting themselves? Because I have a sense that this idea that someone is academically born in one discipline and kind of retires into that discipline, maybe it was never true, but it's definitely less true, I think, these days, where there's a lot more variation, there's a lot more ability to traverse different fields, but also more need to do that because the world is getting more complex and research getting more varied. How do we foster this among new generations?
It's an irony that that's happening on a trajectory in which universities are becoming harder and harder places for that to happen. And so I think it's no one thing that creates the space where this future can thrive, but an important piece of that is being in the struggle to hold space within the institution of a university in sort of all the stuff that we are familiar with under the umbrella of austerity U and neoliberal U that sort of renders people contingent and as data points and so much. So fighting that stuff is key. And then I think senior people, folks who have institutional and identity-based power, of course, always being in accountable relation with folks who have less of those things, to take seriously, how do we make space for the brilliance of this next generation? My emeritus colleague, Dick Morrill, who he's my inspiration for how to age gracefully as an academic. So often in the eclectic and ever-changing nature of geography, when someone who's been in the field for a long time walks out of a colloquium talk in a department, they'll be like, I didn't understand any of that. Where's the discipline going? Dick one time bounded out of a colloquium in our department. He was probably 80 at the time, bounds out of the room and goes, I didn't understand any of that. It's geography. Wasn't that great? And I think that's an important impulse, that curiosity rather than judgment, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Then the third thing is, I think, I was saying this to some grad students in our department last week. Love makes us brave. And I mean that not in the sense of a sort of warm affective feeling, but in that sense of enacted commitment to work really hard with and for someone. And like that work that we do as colleagues, as mentors, and it's not just down the generations, it happens in all the directions. But that I think is really vital to sort of, because creativity is hard, it's scary, it's vulnerable.
Yeah.
Like you have to be okay with not being okay and going, it doesn't make sense yet, but it's going to. And we must, like in geography or any discipline, if we do the grounded work of enacting love in that sense, it makes this stuff possible.
That's pretty powerful. There's so much I'd like to ask you, and I know Rachel also has a lot to discuss, but I have one more question that I want to run by you, and that I want to miss the chance. For someone who's been within GIScience or has seen GIScience since its very inception, and that at the same time has also been in a multiplicity of other domains and has the critical GIS perspective and then the non-GIS perspective that comes with working in other areas. I'm really curious to see how you've seen this last 20, 30 years within GIScience, but more generally, with the world becoming more datafied, with the role of data going from something that it was almost the monopoly of a few very niche academics 30 years ago, to something that is very much ingrained in the fabric of everyday life. What does the world feel like to you? And I think, or how have you witnessed this transition? Yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
Excuse me. I feel like over the last 20 or 30 years, we've built an increasingly sophisticated way of thinking about the question, or coming to grips with the question of what does GIS do, or what do digital spatial technologies do? By which I mean, we can think across the kind of the algorithmic workings, or sort of the thing that is data, and what the encoding of data or its provenance, its really complicated provenance, and sort of the data explosion sort of leads to. You know, we get sort of the multiplicity of ways that digitality and visuality kind of unfold, and sort of the more than Cartesian ways that that is working now. And so as that kind of conceptual apparatus has grown more sophisticated, technologies, databases, worlds have been changing around us. And so there's always more to kind of know and do. I agree that sort of datafication and sort of the explosion of data and the tremendous expansion of the ways that the forms that data takes and the places that it comes from is part of the scene. But I also, you know, want to shout to, for instance, some of these really important interventions in the last decade, last 5 years especially, that are coming from arenas of thought like Black geographies and sort of traditions that draw on questions of carcerality and sort of racial violence as intrinsically linked to datafication. Like, that's important for us to pay attention to.
Great. Okay, as I said, I would continue talking for a very long time, but probably not in the interest of the group. So I'm going to pass on to Rachel and the SAD cocktail party. Thank you very much, Sarah. This was fantastic.
We always find it a little bit tricky to stop the conversation because it's so interesting. But hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions and just sort of follow up, because I think everyone just has lots of neurons firing. So let me start by saying thank you for being willing to play along with this part of the interview. For a little bit of a different interview perspective, we asked you to imagine that you're invited to a dinner party, a sad dinner party. And the original inspiration for this part of the interview comes from Desert Island Discs, which is a UK radio show that asks guests to imagine themselves as castaways. And so after years of pandemic on our virtual islands, we thought maybe what you want is some interaction. And it sounds like you like the interaction. So this will be good, I hope. So the sad dinner party invitation asks you to bring along 4 people as dinner companions, a book in case you get bored and have to entertain yourself, some small talk for the after dinner conversation, including 1 nugget of wisdom, 1 regret, 1 fortuitous event, and 1 formative memory or experience. So we have a little bit less than 15 minutes. So if it's okay with you, let's get everyone seated at the table first, and then we can talk about the after dinner conversation. So for your dinner, I don't know if you want me to say or if you'd like to say, but who would you invite to dinner?
I am going to invite to dinner my maternal grandmother, Marcella Anderson, because all my life, from my deeply sort of place-grounded family, I have been hearing, you look like her, you sound like her, you remind her of us. And so she is known to me, but she died several years before my sister and I were born. And so, like, there's a kind of deeply embodied knowing of this person and a great curiosity. And then I would invite my beloved PhD student, Isaac Rivera, my colleague, Carrie Freshour, and sort of colleague in the field, Latoya Eves. Why these three? Well, because I think that we get together at the table with Grandma. They're all three people who appreciate future creativities and the ways that they grow from pasts. And so I think that they're sort of perfect for this intergenerational conversation. They're going to love Grandma Marcella. And also, like, we want the future in the room for the dinner, right? And these three are sort of doing, like so many others in our field, but they're three who are known to me, who I think have a lot of sort of crosstalk that would be wonderful. So let's get the future of geography in the room and sort of some grounded place-based pasts in the room and see what happens.
And would this be a group, leaving aside your grandmother, of course, that you have been in conversation with in person? Like this would be picking up the flow of a conversation that already exists, or you would start new conversations?
I think I would want to start new conversations that grow out of things that each of us knows that the other one does. Like maybe the place to start this conversation is sort of with the geographers in the room, tell us what is one thing, that one unexpected thing that tracks from the work of someone else around the table into yours? Like, how do we make visible the sort of learnings from each other that are so often invisible? Like, yeah, we all reference, we all do acknowledgements, but there are sort of mutual learnings that are always in the room with us. And I think Isaac and Latoya and Carrie are people who would be primed to like charge into the conversation with that opening.
Yeah, well, that's sort of like Danny, when the phrase intellectual omnivore sort of stuck with me. And I wonder, I mean, it sounds like you're very comfortable stretching yourself, not only in terms of research into new areas, but also into sort of new relationships and discussions with people, that would not be something you would feel shy about. You would feel comfortable initiating the new conversations.
True confessions. I'm an introvert who can flip the switch when the situation requires it. Like so many of us, I can perform completely sort of together, kind of confident on the outside, even as I feel a deep reservation, anxiety, and shyness on the inside.
Yeah, I think that it seems like it's almost like an inherent to academics. Like that's how a lot of us operate. And I
think why so many academics are so weary. Like, yes, the fact that we work at Austerity U is one reason, but I also think it's because many of us are introverts with good manners, and so we are exhausted often by the intensely collective human nature of academic life.
Yeah, well, and I had a question about your grandmother too, actually, and it was a question that came to mind when you mentioned Dick Morrill and the sort of, the aging gracefully. When you picture your grandmother, if you were to imagine this conversation, is this your grandmother like at your age? I mean, is it a grandmother? Is this like an 80-year-old? Is this a 40-year-old? Is this your grandmother when she's young? Like how is she contributing, and what role is age playing here, and experience and wisdom?
I would love to listen to her with the wisdom of age. One of the great gifts that my parents gave us as children was an intergenerational community that was deeply attentive to having the elderly in it. She didn't live to be particularly elderly, but I would, as much as I am sort of inspired and delighted by the stories of who she was as a teenager, she cut her hair in the 20s, she wore bloomers, there are photographs of her mowing the lawn, she drove her father's Model A at 35 miles an hour down Main Street in Deer Creek, Illinois. I would love to have sort of the reflection of her 60s, having raised 5 kids and sort of been in her place, in her time, pushing the edges of what was possible and appropriate in sort of subtle ways, but really transformative ways. I would love to have the benefit of that wisdom.
Yeah. So I really want to get to the after dinner conversation, but when I asked you to bring a book, you suggested a book actually that everyone could be in conversation with. And it was this Dear Data, A Friendship in 52 Weeks of Postcards by Georgia Lupi and Stephanie Posevich, I think is maybe how it's said, or Posevec. But I had to go Google it because I wasn't familiar with it. And then it was like a rabbit hole. It's so
cool. That's why it's coming to dinner.
So what, so what attracts you to that book?
I was thinking about, in part, how do I bring a book to dinner that my grandmother can engage? She's, to all accounts, a brilliant woman, but we can't bring academic speak. And her life is sort of the epitome of kitchen table theory in a lot of ways. And so theory, politics, transformative wisdoms out of everyday life is going to have to be the domain around which this conversation takes shape, even as it includes 3 beloved fellow travelers in academia. And so what I love about that book is it's these 2 artists on opposite sides of the ocean, and each week they made a postcard to send to the other that does some kind of infographic, artistic infographic, representing something that they did that week. And so it gets at some of the perplexities that have sort of followed me around in my academic life, but it comes from women's full lives and comes from sort of deep and abiding friendships across time and space. So I picked it because it brings all that stuff to the room.
Yeah, but it's interesting. It's interesting that you phrase it that way, because this is a spatial analytics and data interview. And Danny's last question sort of touched on GIScience and data. But this is, it's true. It's a book sort of by designers, and you could call them infographics, but they're incredibly sophisticated, both artistically, and then you flip them over and then there's the, basically like the code book and the explanation of how you interpret these graphics. So they're super sophisticated and they're works of art. And so I just wondered, from that perspective, from the data perspective, does that speak to you, that sort of the aesthetics of information?
It absolutely does, because I think that you're picking up on sort of what I love and find so creative about that book. It is about sort of pieces of data encoding, questions of representation, and that are sort of fundamental to spatial data science, sort of spatial analysis, but yet it explicitly and intentionally engages the artistic. And the sort of generative tension between those things has always been something that I'm intrigued by. There's a piece of art that you see on the wall right there that it just, all of a sudden when I saw that art, I was like, oh, it's the sort of collision of artistic land representations of land and topographies and the gridding of digitality, but the question of how they can coexist. Dear Data does kind of the same thing.
Yeah, it's really great. It's fantastic. It also just makes me feel like I wish I had more time for creativity. If I had a complaint, my complaint would be that there's just no headspace or space or time space to do those things. So I want to keep us moving. We probably don't get to all of the reflective conversation, but let's suppose that we clear the plates and the conversation takes on a more reflective tone. Maybe there's an after dinner drink or a warm tea. And I think, because I want to make sure that I get to this, I'm curious about piece of wisdom or advice that you might have to offer to people who are listening or people who might listen in the future selves?
On the eve of me going to graduate school, racked with sort of anxiety about if I would measure up, what this would be like. A professor of mine from my undergraduate years, Linnea Stenson, who taught the first gay and lesbian studies class that was ever offered at McAllister College. Linnea, who was finishing a PhD program in English, said, the question is not, are you good enough to succeed in graduate school? You are. That's true, that's true of anybody who goes. It's a fight for sort of belief and confidence in the thing that you want to do. Don't stand by people who make you feel stupid. And that stand by the people who make you feel capable and creative. And that is advice that I can't take credit for that wisdom because it was gifted to me, but I try to pass it along because it really is like, academia, a discipline, is like any human community. We encounter people who sting, and I think it's important to remember that any academic is in a creative industry, and you have to be in sort of affirmative relation to be creative.
Yeah.
That's why fighting for the integrity and the humanity of academic spaces is so important, because the work that the world needs us to do happens in that context.
Yeah, I agree with you. When I read this advice, I was thinking, of course you should stand next to people who give you good feelings. But then I wondered about the people who, I think there's an inclusion question here, and I don't think it's fully framed because this is something I've been ruminating over. But a challenge across life, but especially in academia, is that I'm not sure that I'm always, I don't know how you feel about this, but I'm not always the person that other people, the people with power would say makes them happy. In other words, I think the people who have power and are central to disciplines in academia, they feel happy and smart and capable and creative when they're with other people who also possess those attributes. And so it can be really tricky to figure out how to make space for the people who don't yet have those assets to contribute. And so I think actually so I guess it's an addendum, we need to try and make other people feel smart and creative, that it's this active piece. It's not only about what makes us feel good, but we need to actively make other people feel good. Yeah, sorry, that was not a very coherent sort of follow-on to your advice.
No,
but I just think, sure, but this homophilia is a problem because people like to be with people who make them feel good.
I think that yes, absolutely, this is a two-way street. And I think sort of the nugget of don't stand by people who make you feel stupid, can be sort of expanded out to be understood as people who have an intent to injure or to make small.
Yeah.
Some of the most important learning that I have done, I feel like in the last decade, has been through the sort of gentle rebukes of, in particular, grad students of color in my seminars who have sort of gently said, actually, and furthermore, you might want to reflect on some of the closures in your own analysis. Those are not touchy-feely moments, but they are fundamental to sort of noting the sort of change and further learning that somebody like me needs to go out and do.
Yeah. So Megan has turned her camera on, which means that I'm just about out of time. Could we squeeze in regret? Because regrets are so important. Do you have regrets?
In the context of my academic life, one of the things that as I look at the past in sort of my educational trajectory, I wish I'd been braver and less afraid on some things. Like there's courses and experiences that I took a pass on because I was intimidated. and I've had moments of sort of being able to sort of have a do-over, if you will, from those sort of, I'll take a pass because don't think I can do this, or it's one step too far. But, I think there's a whole bunch of things in undergrad and grad school that like I could have omnivored in some even edgier ways that would be interesting to see where that had taken me now.
And have you conquered that now? I mean, would you have advice about how to put yourself in a position now? I mean, we're not old. We still have decades ahead of us. Like, how do we make sure that we're not looking back in 30 years from now and saying, shoot, I wish that at age 50 I hadn't, like, or have you figured out how to not worry about that?
I don't know. I think as I'm coming up on turning 50 here in the next 6 months or so, I'm trying to figure that out, because I'm discovering in reflection on myself that suddenly in the last several years, some anxieties are falling away, and there's a certain kind of freeing in this life moment. And so I feel I am both tougher and more tenderhearted all at the same time, and I'm trying to figure out what that means for the next chapter.
Excellent.
So the answer is, I don't know.
But
we're all just trying to live into it.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much. And I can see that there's at least a question or two in the Q&A, so I'll be quiet. And yeah, maybe, and Danny, Levi, maybe you want to come on back and let's see what the audience has to say.
Do you want, I've just been in the Q&A to see one of the questions. Do you want me to take a crack at it?
That sounds great. I feel like it's a good launching point.
Antonio Paez asks, aging gracefully is such a beautiful thought. When is the appropriate time to take a bow and exit left? I don't know, because I haven't done it. But I think I am resolved to try not to stay too long. And I think that too long is, I will know too long when I feel the curiosity, if I feel kind of the curiosity withering away, and I start to feel sort of consistently, many days in a row, kind of grumpy about the trajectory of the field, like that probably says the problem is not the field, the problem is me. And so there's that. And I think aging, we know that it's time to go perhaps when we are so excited about the next thing that the fears of leaving this thing are smaller than the excitement of the next thing. It's, I sometimes use this to talk about coming out. When the uncertainties of doing that are smaller than the struggle of not doing it, then it's time.
That's great. It's a little bit like what you said about goodbyes being hard, that you know that when you're willing to take on the work of the goodbye, that's probably a sign.
Yep.
Yeah, we started with a heavy hitting question, followed, or that came after goosebumps at certain moments through how you're answering those questions. And for me, something that stood out to me was epistemological reflexes, and how there's some things that just become ingrained with us that then we see carry through our work. And so reflexes made me think about creativity as well as curiosity as muscles, and how we have to at times like work on them. We can't how do we continually engage and build, and not that we have to build muscles, and not to go down that rabbit hole, but how we make space to practice curiosity and creativity and like build that energy time and time again. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts on thinking about creativity and curiosity at an institutional level, but how we carve that out in our everyday spaces and in our work.
I think we follow it through the people who inspire us, for sure. And so like being open to a range of sort of people in our academic life strikes me as important. I think also we kind of develop practices that work for us. So like one thing that has always worked for me is, for the last few years, Vicki and I have needed to sort of do some sort of intentional things around AAG sessions for the Relational Poverty Network. But until we were doing that work, for most of my career, when in that season, when for any national conference, the calls for papers are coming out, I sort of let them wash over me with kind of an open heart and always try to pick one that is a stretch or that is kind of a creative sideways and that I'm not quite sure about, because whatever happens is interesting. So for me, that's like one thing that I've tried to do to kind of keep the curiosity, because it's low risk.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. I see we're already a little bit over time, and we don't have any questions coming in, but I just, I'm not really part of the organizational team, but I just want to thank you for participating, for being in conversation with us, for taking lots of different questions in lots of different arenas, and being just an excellent model of, how to make space for others in the field as well. And so with that, anybody else have any last thoughts? I will say, Sarah, I think maybe the only time we actually met, the first thing you mentioned was data.
So apparently I'm playing a one-note horn.
No, and it was just so fitting. It was one of those books that as soon as you mentioned it, I ordered it by the time I got home, and it has been so helpful. And so I think we can continue this train of bringing it to all dinner parties everywhere, because you did. I think it was in Baltimore in whatever year.
Well, we should probably have a dinner party where we bring the Atlas counterpoint from the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, because it is another sort of different but really profoundly transformational intervention that picks up some of these same themes and brings like this amazing collectivity of practice into its covers. So let's have a dinner party with that one.
That sounds great.
Thank you so much for doing this. And thank you, Megan, for chairing us, keeping us mostly on time. That's fantastic.
Yeah,
Colleagues,
thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's so fun to get to think with you about these things.
Yeah, well, this was great.
Fantastic.
And thank you to all the attendees as well for coming today.
All right, everyone. Goodbye.
Take care all.
Goodbye.